She woke to the whisper of silk against her skin, remembering nothing in a luxury hotel suite. Her only clue was the man who put her there, the powerful and reclusive judge. His intense, protective gaze promised to break down her defenses, drawing her into a slow-paced romance as intriguing and captivating as the man himself. If you love elegant romance, subscribe to the channel and join our family. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. The first thing Ivy Sanders registered was the scent. It was a complex and utterly intoxicating blend of old leather, expensive cologne, and the clean, crisp aroma of rain-washed air. It clung to the impossibly high thread count sheets and the heavy cashmere blanket pooled around her waist. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, her mind a frustrating blank canvas where the memories of last night were supposed to be. The room was vast, a symphony of muted charcoals, deep navies and gleaming chrome, a space designed with such meticulous, architectural precision that it made her own professional aspirations feel small and distant. Every line was perfect, every texture deliberate, from the polished marble of the distant fireplace to the plush, dark wool of the rug beneath her bare feet. When she finally swung them over the edge of the bed, she found a silk robe, the color of a midnight sky, draped over a sleek armchair, and slipped it on. Its cool, heavy fabric felt like a second skin, a borrowed identity in a life that was clearly not her own. She padded across the silent room, her reflection a ghostly figure in the polished surfaces of the minimalist furniture. The windows were not just windows. They were walls of glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. Rain lashed against the panes in thick, silvery sheets, driven by a wind that moaned with a low, mournful sound. The city, usually a vibrant tapestry of light and noise, was subdued, humbled by the storm's immense power, a detail that only amplified her sense of complete and utter isolation. Her own clothes were neatly folded on a valet stand, a simple black dress, her sensible heels. They looked jarringly out of place, like a sparrow that had wandered into an eagle's nest. There was no purse, no phone, no keycard, just the clothes and the deafening silence of the suite. A flicker of panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. She took a deep breath, trying to anchor herself to the tangible. She was an architect. She understood structure, order, and logic. There had to be a logical explanation for this, a sequence of events that led her from the industry awards dinner she vaguely remembered to this opulent cage in the sky. Then she heard it. The soft, distinct clink of ceramic on stone. The sound came from an adjoining room, a space she hadn't yet dared to look into. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She wasn't alone. The realization was both terrifying and, in a strange way, a relief. An answer at least was nearby. She tightened the belt of the silk robe, her knuckles white, and moved toward the wide open doorway, every sense on high alert. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee now mingled with the scent of rain, a disarmingly domestic smell in this impossibly luxurious setting. She peered around the corner, her breath held tight in her chest. A man stood with his back to her, looking out another one of the magnificent windows. He was tall, his frame outlined by the stormy grey light, wearing a simple pair of dark trousers and a soft grey sweater that did little to hide the powerful breadth of his shoulders. He held a coffee mug in one hand, perfectly still, a portrait of calm authority. He seemed as much a part of the expensive, curated environment as the art on the walls, a man who belonged to this world of silent power and breathtaking views. He seemed to be waiting, though for what she couldn't possibly guess. He spoke without turning, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and right into her bones. "I figured you might be awake." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with a calm assurance that was both unsettling and magnetic. The sound of his voice was the first solid piece of this puzzle, and it was a piece that suggested he held all the others. He was the stranger from her forgotten night, the gatekeeper to her own memories, and his quiet confidence told her that he was entirely in control of this situation. She watched the rigid line of his back, a wall she would have to scale to find her way out. He turned around slowly, and the first thing that struck Ivy was the sheer, unapologetic intensity of his gaze. His eyes were a startlingly clear shade of blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held an unnerving intelligence. a sense of quiet assessment that made her feel as if he could see right through the borrowed silk and the bravado she was trying to muster. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 40s, with faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and immense pressure. His dark hair was slightly damp, as if from a recent shower, and a subtle shadow of stubble lined a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. This was not the face of a man accustomed to taking no for an answer. "My name is Aiden Parker," he said, his voice retaining that same deep, steady cadence. He gestured with his mug toward a small, elegant dining table set for two. "I took the liberty of ordering coffee, and breakfast if you're hungry." His manners were impeccable, his tone even, yet there was an undercurrent of something unyielding in his presence. It was the calm of a predator, the stillness of a man who knows he holds all the cards. This wasn't a casual morning after. This felt like a summons, a negotiation she hadn't agreed to. Ivy found her voice, though it came out thinner than she would have liked. "Where am I? What happened last night?" She clutched the robe tighter, the silky fabric a poor substitute for armor. Her mind raced, sifting through fragments, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation at the awards dinner, a charismatic speaker on stage, and then nothing, a complete and total void. The blankness was terrifying. A stolen chapter from her own life, and this man, Aiden Parker, was the only one who seemed to have a copy of the missing pages. Aiden took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're at the Elysian Grand, in the presidential suite. As for last night," he paused, setting the mug down with a deliberate soft click. "You seemed to be in some distress at the event. You were disoriented. I was concerned for your safety, so I offered to see you home. It appears you misplaced your purse and your phone along the way." His explanation was concise, logical, and yet it felt entirely too simple. It didn't explain the sheer opulence of their surroundings, nor the fact that he hadn't just called her a cab or taken her to a hospital. "So you brought me here?" Ivy asked, a note of incredulity creeping into her voice. "To the most expensive hotel suite in the city, why?" She took a tentative step into the room, her bare feet sinking into the plush rug. The air crackled with a strange energy, a palpable tension that was about more than just her forgotten memories. It was the friction of two worlds colliding, her world of blueprints and budgets and his world of whatever this was. A world where a presidential suite was a casual solution to a stranger's distress. He moved from the window, his movements fluid and economical, and gestured to one of the chairs at the table. The storm was getting worse. This was the closest, safest place. "The city is essentially shut down, Miss Sanders. No cars in or out. The power is intermittent in most districts. We are, for the time being, stranded here." He delivered the news with the same dispassionate calm, as if discussing the weather. This wasn't just a hotel room. It was a sanctuary, a fortress against the chaos raging outside, and he was its warden. The trope of forced proximity had just become their stark reality. He held her gaze, and she saw the first flicker of something beyond his control in those winter blue eyes, a hint of a man as trapped by circumstance as she was. Ivy sank into the offered chair, the rich leather cool against her skin. Stranded. The word echoed in the opulent silence, a stark and undeniable fact. She looked past Aiden, through the vast expanse of glass at the swirling grey maelstrom outside. The wind howled, a physical manifestation of her own inner turmoil. The city lights, usually a brilliant, glittering carpet, were sporadic and weak. Entire blocks plunged into darkness. He was right. They were in an island in the sky, cut off from the world below. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold, heavy stone, a feeling of absolute powerlessness she hadn't experienced since she was a child. Aiden sat down opposite her, a silent and imposing presence. He poured her a cup of coffee from a silver pot, the liquid a dark, fragrant stream. The simple domestic act was so at odds with the tension coiling between them. "My apologies. I haven't properly introduced myself. You are Ivy Sanders, the architect who won the Vanguard Award last night. Your speech was immemorable." His words were a small offering, a bridge across the chasm of her missing memories. She had won, a flicker of pride, quickly extinguished by the overwhelming strangeness of her situation. She couldn't remember her moment of triumph, only the disorienting aftermath. "I don't remember any of it," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The speech," leaving the event. You. Her gaze met his, searching for a sign, a clue, anything to help her piece together the narrative. His expression was unreadable, a carefully composed mask of polite concern. There was a discipline in his stillness, a sense of immense self-control that she, as an architect who revered structure and design, could almost admire. He was a fortress, and she had no idea how to find the gate. He pushed the cup and saucer toward her, his fingers long and steady. Perhaps it's for the best. The end of the evening was chaotic. A fire alarm was pulled, a false alarm, but it caused a great deal of panic. That's when we were separated from your colleagues. His explanation was smooth, filling in the gaps with plausible details, yet it felt rehearsed, edited for her consumption. He was giving her the structure, the blueprint of the evening, but omitting the texture, the emotion, the truth of it. This felt less like a rescue and more like a carefully managed containment. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, the heat a small comfort against the chill of her uncertainty. "And you are Aiden Parker. What is it that you do, Mr. Parker?" The question hung in the air, a test. His identity was a crucial piece of the puzzle. The way he carried himself, the effortless command of his environment, the sheer expense of this safe place, it all pointed to a man of significant means and influence. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. There was an aura of authority about him that was more profound, more ingrained. It was the quiet confidence of a man who didn't just play the game. He set the rules. He met her question with a long, silent look. For a moment she thought he might not answer, that he would deflect with another polite, evasive statement. The pause stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. He was weighing his words, deciding what to reveal, what to conceal. The world of luxury romance she had woken up in was beginning to show its more complicated, secretive side. He was a man with layers, and she suspected each one was more heavily guarded than the last. He finally broke the silence, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. "I'm a judge." The words settled in the space between them, heavy and irrefutable. A judge. Not a lawyer, not a CEO, but a judge. The title recontextualized everything. The calm authority, the measured speech, the aura of unassailable power. It explained the fortress of his composure, and the analytical way his eyes seemed to be constantly weighing and measuring her. Ivy felt a fresh wave of unease wash over her. She was stranded in a storm in a stranger's hotel suite, with a man whose entire profession was built on passing judgment. It was a detail that made her own vulnerability feel 10 times more acute. "A judge," she repeated, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. She tried to reconcile the image of a black-robed arbiter of the law with the man in the soft grey sweater sitting across from her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his expression unchanging. He was clearly not a man who felt the need to elaborate or impress. His title was a fact, like his name, and he presented it as such. There was no ego, only a quiet statement of his place in the world, a place that felt impossibly far from her own. A server from room service arrived then, a silent, efficient man who laid out an elaborate breakfast without a word, as if he were accustomed to entering rooms where the tension was a palpable living entity. There were silver domes covering plates of eggs, fresh fruit arranged like a work of art, and a basket of pastries that smelled of butter and cinnamon. The sheer extravagance of it all felt absurd, a surreal feast in the midst of her confusion and anxiety. It was another reminder of Aiden's world, where comfort and luxury were summoned with effortless ease, even in the middle of a city-wide lockdown. When they were alone again, the silence that fell was different. It was no longer just the silence of two strangers, but the weighted silence between someone who held all the power and someone who had none. Ivy picked at a perfect red strawberry, her appetite gone. "So, Judge Parker," she began, testing the title, "what happens now?" "We just wait for the storm to pass." The question sounded naive even to her own ears. It felt as though much more than a simple weather front needed to pass before anything could return to normal. Aiden finally broke his stoic composure, a faint line appearing between his brows. "That is the practical reality, yes. The city's emergency services have advised everyone to stay off the roads. The power grid is unstable. Here we have our own generators, security and resources. It is the safest place for you to be." He was her protective hero, whether she wanted him to be or not, his logic as unassailable as the storm-proof glass of the windows. He had anticipated every contingency, solved every problem, except for the one that mattered most, the unbridgeable gap between them. She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the title and the power. She saw the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around his eyes. She saw the profound solitude in the way he held himself, a man isolated by his own position. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who had for his own reasons chosen to bring her here. This wasn't just a simple act of charity. There was something more at play, a motivation hidden behind the calm facade and the logical explanations. This slow burn of discovery was just beginning, and the heat was an unnerving mix of fear and a strange nascent curiosity. She met his gaze across the table and saw a flicker of something human, a hint of a man as lost in this strange intimacy as she was. Ivy stood before the wall of windows, her coffee cup grown cold in her hands. The city below was a watercolor painting left out in the rain, its sharp architectural lines blurred and softened by the relentless downpour. For a moment, she allowed herself to see it through her architect's eye, appreciating the way the storm transformed the familiar landscape into something moody and ethereal. It was a designer's trick, using light and shadow to create a new perspective. She wondered if that was what Aiden Parker was doing, using the chaos of the storm to create a controlled, isolated environment where he could observe her without the usual variables of the outside world. He came to stand beside her, not too close but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him and catch the faint, clean scent of his cologne. "The city looks different from up here, doesn't it?" he commented, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. Orderly, almost peaceful despite the chaos. It was a judge's perspective, seeing the grand structure, the system, rather than the individual lives being affected down below. She saw beauty in the design. He saw order in the system. The contrast between them was as stark as the gleaming chrome and the soft wool of the suite's interior. "I see the individual buildings," she replied, her voice soft. "The way they connect, the spaces between them. I see the flow of life that's supposed to be there but isn't. To me, it doesn't look peaceful. It looks paused." She traced the outline of a distant skyscraper on the fogged glass. "It's like a blueprint, a beautiful plan, waiting for the people to bring it to life." Her own words surprised her, the easy way she shared her professional perspective with this intimidating stranger. There was something about his quiet presence that invited honesty. Hayden was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the view but his attention clearly on her words. "A blueprint," he repeated thoughtfully. "I've spent my life studying the blueprints of society. The laws, the precedents, the structures that are supposed to keep everything standing. But I rarely get to see the spaces in between." It was a confession, a small unexpected crack in his judicial armor. He was admitting to a limitation, a blind spot, and in this gilded cage, any admission of imperfection felt like a profound act of intimacy. The forced proximity was beginning to work its strange magic, stripping away their public personas and leaving them with the unadorned truth of who they were. She was a creator, he was an interpreter. She designed the spaces, he enforced the rules within them. They were two sides of the same coin, and the realization created a sudden, unexpected spark of connection between them. It wasn't about attraction, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a dawning recognition, a meeting of two minds that saw the world in profoundly different, yet complementary ways. He turned his head slightly, his winter blue eyes meeting hers. The analytical assessment was gone, replaced by something warmer, something that looked a lot like genuine curiosity. "Tell me about your work, Ivy. Tell me about the Vanguard Award. Tell me what it feels like to create something that wasn't there before." The questions were personal, direct, and they bypassed all the polite, meaningless small talk they could have engaged in. He wasn't interested in the weather. He was interested in her, the core of her. And in that moment, she realized the most dangerous thing about this man wasn't his power or his title, but his ability to make her want to be seen. Ivy found herself talking, the words spilling out of her with an ease that felt both liberating and reckless. She spoke of her winning design, a community library that used sustainable materials and natural light to create a space that was both a sanctuary for books and a hub for human connection. She described the challenge of balancing form and function, the thrill of seeing a sketch on a notepad slowly transform into a tangible structure that people could inhabit. Her passion for her work was a language she was fluent in, a safe territory in this otherwise uncertain landscape. Aiden listened with an unnerving stillness, his entire focus narrowed on her. He didn't interrupt, didn't check a non-existent phone, didn't let his gaze wander. He simply absorbed her words, his expression one of deep intellectual concentration. It was the kind of focused attention she had rarely experienced, the attention of a man trained to listen to every nuance, to catch every subtle implication. She felt less like she was having a conversation, and more like she was giving testimony, but a testimony she was eager to provide. It felt good to be heard, to be understood by someone who seemed to appreciate the intricate details of her craft. "So you build spaces that bring people together," he summarized when she finally paused, his voice laced with a new note of understanding. "You create order and beauty out of raw materials. There's a certain justice in that, isn't there? A fairness, giving a community a space that respects them." He had distilled the essence of her entire philosophy into a few simple sentences. He saw the moral core of her work, the why behind the what, and it was a level of perception that she found both startling and deeply attractive. The dynamic between them shifted then, subtly but irrevocably. The fear and confusion that had clouded her morning began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. The opulent suite no longer felt like a prison, but more like a bubble, a temporary reality where the normal rules didn't apply. Here she wasn't just an up-and-coming architect, and he wasn't just a powerful judge. They were simply Ivy and Aiden, two people stranded by a storm, discovering a surprising intellectual kinship. This slow burn was fueled not by flirtation, but by mutual respect. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, turning the sky outside into a deep, bruised purple, a comfortable quiet settled between them. He had retreated to a small study off the main living area, and the sound of pages turning was a soft rhythmic counterpoint to the drumming of the rain. Ivy found a collection of art books on a low shelf and lost herself in the vibrant world of abstract expressionism. The silence wasn't empty or awkward. It was companionable, a shared space where they could exist independently yet together. As dusk settled, Aiden re-emerged from the study. He had taken off the grey sweater and was now just in a dark t-shirt that clung to the lean, hard muscles of his chest and arms. The casual change in attire made him seem younger, more approachable, less like an institution and more like a man. "I was thinking about dinner," he said, his voice softer than before. "The hotel kitchen is still operational for the few guests who are here. We can have something sent up." It was a simple, practical statement, but it carried the weight of a new understanding between them. It was an acknowledgement that this was their reality for now. She looked up from her book, and for the first time since waking up, she offered him a small, genuine smile. Dinner was another surreal affair, served at the same small table, now adorned with a single white candle, whose flame danced and flickered, casting their faces in a warm, intimate glow. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury a stark contrast to the quiet sanctuary they had created. They ate in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of silverware against porcelain and the relentless percussion of the rain. The food was exquisite, but Ivy barely registered the taste. Her senses were entirely focused on the man sitting opposite her, on the way the candlelight carved shadows on the sharp planes of his face. He broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "It must be a strange feeling," he said, "to wake up and find your life has been placed in the hands of a stranger." It wasn't an apology, but an acknowledgement, a demonstration of empathy that surprised her. He was seeing this from her perspective, and his willingness to do so was a far more meaningful gesture than any empty platitude. He was giving her space for her fear, for her confusion, without judgment. It was a gift, and she accepted it gratefully. "It is," she admitted, setting her fork down. "But it's also strangely simple. There are no decisions to make, no deadlines to meet, no emails to answer. There is only this room, this storm, and this conversation." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "For the first time in a very long time, I don't have a blueprint for what comes next." For an architect who lived her life by plans and meticulous schedules, the admission was both terrifying and strangely freeing. She was living entirely in the present moment, a state she so rarely allowed herself to occupy. Aiden leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes catching the candlelight. "And does that frighten you or excite you?" The question was intensely personal, a probe into the very heart of her character. He wasn't making small talk. He was mapping her inner landscape, trying to understand the woman who designed spaces for others, but was now trapped in one of his. The conversation felt like a high-stakes chess match, but one where the goal wasn't to win but to reveal. This was the core of the slow burn, the gradual, deliberate peeling away of layers. "Both," she answered honestly. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken possibilities. The professional respect they had discovered earlier in the day was now being overlaid with something far more personal, far more dangerous. It was the thrill of the unknown, the magnetic pull of a powerful, intelligent man who seemed just as intrigued by her as she was by him. The luxury romance setting was no longer just a backdrop. It was an incubator for an intimacy that was growing at an accelerated rate. He held her gaze for a long, breathless moment. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them and the small, flickering flame between them. The storm outside, the forgotten memories, the uncertain future, it all faded away, leaving only the charged space of the present. He was the protective hero who had offered her shelter, but she was beginning to realize that the real danger wasn't the storm outside, but the one that was beginning to brew inside the walls of this suite. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. The contact was fleeting, a ghost of a touch, but it lingered on her skin like a brand. Ivy's breath hitched, and she instinctively pulled her hand back, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of self-preservation. The simple, accidental gesture had broken an invisible barrier, transforming the intellectual connection they had been building into something intensely physical. The air, already thick with unspoken words, was now charged with a new, potent energy. Aiden, for his part, showed no reaction, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever, yet she saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat, retreating back into the safety of his composure. "It's getting late," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. "The bedroom is yours, of course. I'll take the couch in the living area. It's more than comfortable." He was already re-establishing the boundaries, putting distance between them, but it was too late. The spark had been struck, and they both knew it. The pretense of a simple, platonic arrangement between rescuer and rescued was beginning to feel thin and transparent. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "This suite is enormous. There's a study with a sofa, isn't there? We can both be comfortable." The thought of him sleeping in the same room just a few feet away from where she had awoken that morning sent a fresh wave of heat through her. This forced proximity was a constant test of her resolve, a relentless chipping away at the professional, controlled persona she had spent years building. Under his intense gaze, she felt herself becoming someone else, someone more impulsive, more attuned to the sensory world around her. "It's better this way," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the judge rendering a verdict, final and absolute. He was protecting her, yes, but she suspected he was also protecting himself. He was a man who thrived on control, and this situation, this unexpected intimacy with a woman from a world so different from his own, was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He was trying to manage the chemistry between them with the same logical precision he applied to a court case, but desire was not a legal argument. It was a force of nature, much like the storm outside. Later, as she lay in the vast empty bed, the scent of him still clinging to the pillows, Ivy couldn't sleep. She listened to the sound of the rain, a constant soothing rhythm that failed to calm the frantic beating of her own heart. She could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of his breathing from the other room, a steady presence in the darkness. She was acutely aware of him, of his proximity, of the thin wall that separated them. The space felt both cavernous and claustrophobic, a gilded cage where her own burgeoning feelings were the most dangerous predator. She thought about his touch, the brief electric connection that had promised so much. It was a promise of intimacy, of a passion that simmered just beneath his cool, controlled surface. She had seen a glimpse of the man behind the judge, a man who was perhaps as lonely as he was powerful. And in the quiet darkness of the suite, surrounded by a luxury she had never known, she found herself wanting to see more. She wanted to know the man who listened with such intensity, who understood the soul of her work, who made her feel seen in a way no one ever had before. She closed her eyes knowing that sleep would not come easily, her mind consumed by the thought of the powerful man in the next room. The next morning, the storm had not broken. If anything, the wind howled with a renewed fury, and the rain fell in a solid, impenetrable sheet, erasing the world outside the windows. The sense of isolation was now complete. Ivy awoke feeling a strange sense of peace, a resignation to their situation. The initial panic had been replaced by a quiet anticipation, another day trapped with Aiden Parker. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it sent a slow, warm thrill through her veins. The slow burn was igniting, and she was no longer afraid of the heat. She found him in the living area, standing before the windows again, a dark silhouette against the turbulent grey sky. He was already dressed in a crisp, dark shirt and trousers, the picture of composed authority, even in these extraordinary circumstances. He turned as she approached, and his eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her, taking in the way the borrowed silk robe clung to her form. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was appreciative, the gaze of a connoisseur, and it made her feel both exposed and incredibly feminine. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've already spoken with the hotel manager. The city is still on lockdown. It seems we have another day." He delivered the news as if it were a simple weather report, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. This prolonged, unscheduled intimacy was a complication he was clearly struggling to manage. He was a man of schedules and order, and she was the beautiful, chaotic element that had been introduced into his controlled equation. To fill the long hours, they fell into an easy rhythm. They talked for hours, not about the storm or their predicament, but about everything else. They debated art and philosophy, architecture and law. She discovered he had a dry, wicked sense of humor that was a surprising contrast to his serious demeanor. He learned about her childhood in a small town, her dream of one day designing a museum. They were sketching out the blueprints of each other's souls, discovering the hidden corridors and secret rooms. The luxury romance was becoming less about the opulent setting and more about the rare luxury of finding a true intellectual equal. At one point, to break the intensity, she challenged him to a game of chess using a beautiful, hand-carved marble set she found in the study. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You play?" he asked, a hint of a challenge in his tone. "A bit," she replied with a coy smile. "My grandfather taught me. He said it was like architecture. You have to see the whole structure. Plan your moves 10 steps ahead." The game that followed was a silent, intense battle of wills, a metaphor for the careful dance they were performing around each other. He was a brilliant strategist, of course, his mind sharp and analytical. But she was creative, unpredictable, using moves he didn't anticipate. The game stretched on for over an hour, the only sounds the soft click of marble on marble and the constant drumming of the rain. The air between them was electric, a current of intellectual and physical attraction that grew stronger with every move. He was no longer just the powerful judge, the protective hero. He was Aiden, her brilliant, frustrating, and utterly captivating opponent. Finally, after a long, calculated silence, she moved her queen, a swift, decisive action. "Checkmate," she said softly, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Aiden stared at the board, a look of genuine, unadulterated surprise on his face. It was the first time Ivy had seen him completely unguarded, his judicial mask stripped away to reveal the man beneath. A slow smile spread across his lips, transforming his entire demeanor. It was a real smile, one that reached his winter blue eyes and crinkled the corners, erasing some of the sternness and revealing a charm he clearly kept under tight control. The sight of it did something strange to her insides, a warm, liquid feeling that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Well played, Miss Sanders," he said, his voice holding a new note of deep, genuine respect. "Very well played indeed." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that felt startlingly unguarded. "It's been a very long time since anyone has beaten me." The admission was another crack in his fortress, another glimpse into the isolated world he inhabited. He was a man surrounded by subordinates, by lawyers who deferred to him, by a world that bowed to his authority. He was not a man accustomed to being challenged, let alone bested, especially by a woman he had met less than 48 hours ago. The victory shifted the power dynamic between them once again. She was no longer just the woman he had rescued. She was his equal, an opponent who had met his intellect with her own and emerged victorious. The realization was empowering. In this room, stripped of his title and her professional anxieties, they were just a man and a woman, drawn to each other by a force that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The forced proximity had leveled the playing field, creating a space where the truth of their connection could finally begin to emerge. He got up and walked over to a discreet, built-in bar, the fluid grace of his movements a pleasure to watch. "I think a victory like that deserves a drink," he said, his back to her. "What's your preference?" The question was casual, but it felt significant. He was inviting her to share another level of intimacy, to move from the intellectual sparring of the chessboard to something more relaxed, more personal. The slow burn was transitioning into a new, more dangerous phase. "I don't know," she said honestly. "You choose. Surprise me." She was ceding control back to him, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a surrender. It was an invitation. She was trusting his judgment, not because he was a judge, but because, in the short time she had known him, she had come to learn that his choices were deliberate, thoughtful, and always of the highest quality. She was curious to see what he would choose for her, what his choice would say about how he saw her. He returned with 2 heavy crystal glasses filled with an amber liquid. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers, and this time she didn't pull away. The contact was warm, firm, and it sent a shiver of awareness through her. "A 25-year-old single malt," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It's complex, a little smoky with an unexpected finish. It reminds me of you." The compliment was so specific, so insightful, that it left her momentarily speechless. He didn't just see her. He understood her. He raised his glass, his eyes locking with hers over the rim. "To the storm," he said, "and to unexpected checkmates." She clinked her glass against his, the crystal ringing out a clear, bright note in the quiet room. "To the storm," she echoed, her voice a little breathless. She took a sip of the scotch, the liquid a warm, smoky trail down her throat. It was exactly as he'd described it. Complex, strong, with a surprisingly smooth finish. It was a drink that demanded to be savored, not rushed, much like the man who had poured it. The sensory experience, the taste of the scotch, the weight of the glass in her hand, the intensity of his gaze, it was all-consuming. They migrated from the chess table to the 2 large armchairs near the fireplace, which Aiden lit with the press of a button. A low, mesmerizing flame flickered to life, casting a warm golden glow over the room and pushing back the gloom of the storm. The sound of the crackling fire joined the percussion of the rain, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy. The luxurious setting, which had at first felt so intimidating, was now beginning to feel like a sanctuary, a private world built for just the 2 of them. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, sipping their drinks, watching the flames dance. The alcohol worked its magic, loosening the last of Ivy's inhibitions, making her feel bold. "Why were you at the awards dinner, Aiden?" she asked, the use of his first name feeling both natural and shockingly intimate. "It doesn't seem like your kind of event." She was probing again, trying to understand the circumstances that had led their 2 very different paths to cross. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his expression thoughtful. "I was there as a favor to a friend, the head of the firm that sponsored the event. I rarely attend such things. I find the small talk tedious." His honesty was refreshing. He wasn't a man who wasted time on pretense. "But," he continued, his gaze lifting to meet hers, "I'm beginning to believe in the virtues of serendipity. If I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have heard your speech." There it was again, a reference to the moment she couldn't remember. The moment that had apparently captured the attention of this powerful, enigmatic man. "What was it about my speech?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "You've mentioned it twice." She needed to understand what he had seen in her, what had compelled him to step in, to bring her into his world. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, the catalyst for this entire surreal experience. He paused, choosing his words with his usual judicial care. "You spoke about architecture not as a collection of buildings, but as a responsibility to create spaces that foster community, that inspire awe, that offer sanctuary. He looked around the opulent suite, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. You spoke with a passion and integrity that is rare. In a room full of people talking about profit margins and square footage, you were talking about the soul of a city. It was compelling. His words were a balm to a part of her she hadn't even realized was wounded. But to be seen, to be understood on such a profound level, was an intimacy far deeper than any physical touch. He had heard the unspoken poetry behind her technical plans. The protective hero hadn't just saved her from a chaotic situation. He had recognized the very essence of who she was. The slow burn was no longer slow. It was a steady, rising flame, and she had no desire to extinguish it. She realized she had been holding her breath and let it out in a slow, shaky sigh. The firelight played across the sharp angles of his face, softening the judicial severity and highlighting the exhaustion that seemed permanently etched around his eyes. In that moment, he looked less like a powerful judge and more like a lonely king in his castle. The vulnerability was fleeting, but Ivy saw it, and it resonated with a part of her she rarely showed to the world, the part that knew the loneliness of pursuing a passion, the isolation that came with singular focus. Her world was blueprints and scale models. His was law books and gavels. Both were solitary pursuits. That responsibility you talked about, he continued, his voice softer now, more introspective. It's a heavy weight to carry, isn't it? It wasn't a question directed at her, but a shared sentiment, a bridge between his world and hers. He understood the burden of his own responsibilities, the crushing weight of decisions that altered the course of human lives. He was offering her another piece of himself, a glimpse into the profound solitude of his position. It was a quiet cry for connection from a man who had likely forgotten how to ask for it. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice a near whisper. But it's also what gives the work meaning. Without that weight, it's just steel and glass. It's just words on a page. They were no longer talking about architecture or law. They were talking about life, about purpose, about the things that drove them, the things that kept them up at night. The intimacy of the conversation was so intense, it was almost painful, a deep, resonant chord struck between two people who had been strangers just a day before. He finished his drink. The sound of the ice clinking in the empty glass unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He placed the glass on the marble hearth with a steady hand, but Ivy noticed the tension in his knuckles. This level of emotional exposure was clearly unfamiliar territory for him. He was a man who lived in a world of facts and evidence, not feelings and shared vulnerabilities. This forced proximity was pushing him as far out of his comfort zone as it was pushing her. He started, his voice rough, as if he were about to retreat, to rebuild the walls he had allowed to crumble. But he stopped. He looked at her, his blue eyes dark and turbulent in the firelight. The air between them crackled, a silent, powerful current pulling them together. The careful dance was over. The intellectual sparring had ended. All that was left was the raw, undeniable chemistry that had been simmering beneath the surface from the very beginning. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the firelight, casting her in shadow. He took a step toward her and then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. He was crossing a line, and she knew she should stop him, should say something to break the spell, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. She had been waiting for this moment since she woke up in his bed, wrapped in his scent. The slow burn had finally reached its flashpoint. He stopped in front of her chair, looking down at her, his expression a mixture of desire and a fierce, internal battle. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her temple, a touch that was both incredibly gentle and searingly hot. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness that it shattered her remaining defenses. He leaned down, his face just inches from hers, and she could see the fire reflected in his dark, dilated pupils. His scent enveloped her, that intoxicating mix of expensive cologne, clean linen, and the unique, musky scent of him. Ivy's breath caught in her throat, her entire being focused on the small space between their lips. The world had narrowed to this single charged moment. The roaring wind, the crackling fire, the city sleeping under a blanket of rain, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only Aiden, his presence so overwhelming it felt like a force of gravity, pulling her inexorably closer. She tilted her head up, a silent, instinctual invitation. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching hers, asking a question he wouldn't voice. It was a look that offered her an escape, a final chance to retreat to the safety of their previous boundaries. But Ivy didn't want safety. She wanted this. She wanted the culmination of the tension that had been building between them, the answer to the unspoken question that had hung in the air since she first laid eyes on him. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a complete surrender to the moment. That was all the confirmation he needed. He closed the remaining distance and his lips met hers. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, of pent-up longing finally unleashed. It was firm, demanding, and yet incredibly tender. It was the kiss of a man who had been starved for connection, for a warmth he had long denied himself. His hand moved from her hair to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek as he deepened the kiss. Exploring her mouth with a practiced, devastating skill, Ivy melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. A soft sound escaped her throat, a sigh of pure, unadulterated pleasure. It was a kiss that erased all the confusion, all the fear, all the uncertainty of the past 2 days. It was a kiss that made perfect, undeniable sense. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the keystone that locked the entire structure of their connection into place. This was why he had brought her here, not just to protect her, but because he had felt this same magnetic, irresistible pull. The kiss went on, a long, slow exploration that was both a discovery and a homecoming. It was a conversation without words, a perfect fusion of his controlled passion and her creative spirit. The closed door of his judicial reserve was finally swinging open, and she was stepping inside, into the private, hidden world of Aiden Parker. It was a world of intense feeling, of deep, unspoken loneliness, and a powerful protective instinct that was now entirely focused on her. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. His eyes were dark, stormy, his composure completely shattered. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The powerful judge, the man who held the fates of others in his hands, looked utterly undone. And in his vulnerability, he was more beautiful, more captivating than he had ever been. "Ivy," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips, a confession of a feeling he had no words for yet. He didn't move away. He stayed there, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm on her skin. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones, as if he were memorizing the structure of her, the blueprint of her features. The raw desire in his eyes was tempered by a look of profound wonder. The kiss had changed everything, shattering the carefully constructed walls between them and leaving them in a new, uncharted territory of emotional intimacy. The air was thick with what had been unleashed, a potent cocktail of passion and vulnerability. "I shouldn't have done that," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't regret. It was something closer to awe or perhaps fear. Fear of the intensity of what he was feeling, of the power she now held over him. The man who was always in control had just willingly, completely lost it. This was the heart of the protective hero trope, the strong, unshakable man brought to his knees by the one woman who could see past his armor. "Why not?" she whispered, her own voice shaky. She didn't want him to retreat, to rebuild his fortress. She had just found her way inside, and the thought of being shut out again was unbearable. She placed her hands over his, a silent plea for him to stay, to not let the logic of his world intrude on the magic of this one. "Aiden, why not?" She needed to hear him say it, to admit that this was more than just a consequence of their forced proximity. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, marshalling the evidence. "Because this is a complication. Our worlds are fundamentally incompatible. I live a life that is under constant scrutiny, a life that is rigid, demanding, and often very isolating. You are a creator, a free spirit. To bring you into my world," he trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "To bring you into my world would be to cage you." He was protecting her not from a storm, but from himself, from the gilded cage of his own life. She gently pulled his hands away from her face, holding them in her lap. "Let me be the judge of that," she said softly, turning his own profession back on him. A faint smile touched her lips. "You design the laws that govern society. I design the spaces where society lives. Maybe our worlds aren't so incompatible after all." Maybe they're just two different ways of looking for the same thing. And what's that? He asked, his voice low. Balance, she replied. Structure and beauty. Rules and freedom. Maybe one can't exist without the other. His gaze searched hers, and she could see the internal conflict raging within him. His logical mind was presenting all the reasons why this was a mistake, a temporary insanity brought on by the storm. But his heart, a part of him he had long kept under lock and key, was presenting a different argument. An argument based on the undeniable evidence of their connection. The way she had challenged him, understood him, and now touched him in a way that had shaken him to his very core. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of surrender. He wasn't retreating. He was staying. He was choosing to remain in this complicated, beautiful moment with her. The slow burn had blossomed into a full, roaring fire, and they were both willingly walking into the flames. This wasn't just a billionaire romance. It was a collision of souls, a fusion of two powerful forces that had found each other in the eye of the storm. He leaned in again, and this time his kiss was different. It was slower, deeper, a promise of a night that would change them both forever. The world outside the suite ceased to exist. The storm became a distant, muffled soundtrack to the intensely private world they were creating between the fire and the rain. The kiss deepened, a slow, languid exploration that spoke of a deep, soul-shattering need. This was the essence of a closed-door romance, where the sensuality was conveyed not through explicit detail, but through the powerful current of emotion, the sensory details of the moment, the taste of scotch on his lips, the rough texture of his stubble against her soft skin, the soft wool of his shirt beneath her questing fingers. Aiden lifted her from the chair as if she weighed nothing, his movements fluid and certain. He carried her from the living area, through the silent, darkened suite and into the bedroom. The pearly grey light of the storm-drenched city filtered through the windows, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. He laid her gently on the vast bed, the cool silk sheets a shocking contrast to the heat building between them. He stood over her for a moment, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the backdrop of the city, his eyes never leaving hers. He slowly began to unbutton his shirt, his gaze locked on her, a silent communication passing between them that was more intimate than any words. It was a look of pure adoration, of a man who had found something precious and was terrified of breaking it. Ivy watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every slow, deliberate movement was an act of revelation, a peeling away of the final layers of the powerful Judge Parker to reveal the vulnerable, passionate man who was Aiden. He came to her then, his hands gentle as they pushed the silk robe from her shoulders, his eyes worshipping every inch of skin he uncovered. His touch was electric, igniting a firestorm within her that matched the one raging outside. He murmured her name against her skin, a litany of reverence. This wasn't just desire. It was a form of salvation. He was a man drowning in the solitude of his life, and she was his first breath of air. The protective hero was allowing himself to be saved. They spent the night exploring the uncharted territory of each other. It was a slow, sensual journey of discovery. They learned the rhythm of each other's breathing, the texture of each other's skin, the secret, sensitive places that elicited a soft sigh or a sharp intake of breath. It was a dance of exquisite tenderness and barely controlled passion, a perfect balance of giving and taking. The luxury romance was no longer about the setting. It was about the priceless luxury of a perfect, unhurried connection. In the deepest hours of the night, wrapped in his arms, with the storm still whispering its secrets against the glass, Ivy felt a sense of peace she had never known. She was not a damsel in distress, and he was not just her rescuer. They were two equals who had found in each other a missing piece of their own design. He was the unyielding structure that gave her creative spirit a safe place to land, and she was the beautiful, unpredictable element that brought light and color into his monochrome world. She drifted to sleep, his heartbeat a steady, reassuring drum against her ear, a promise in the darkness. Ivy awoke slowly, coming to consciousness in layers. The first thing she registered was the weight of a heavy arm draped possessively over her waist. The second was the warmth of a solid, muscular body pressed against hers, a human furnace chasing away the morning chill. The third was the scent, his scent, deeper and more potent than before, now mingled with her own. It was the scent of intimacy, of a night spent tangled in silk sheets and shared secrets. For a blissful, disoriented moment, she simply existed in the pure, sensory pleasure of the morning. Then the memories rushed back in, not as a confusing fog, but as a series of vivid, heart-stopping snapshots. The kiss by the fire, the look in his eyes, the feel of his skin against hers. A slow, warm blush crept up her neck. She had slept with the powerful, enigmatic Judge Aiden Parker. She had given herself to a man whose last name she had only learned a day ago. The architect in her, the planner, the woman who lived by logic and control, should have been panicking. But she wasn't. There was no regret, only a profound sense of rightness, as if a fundamental, misaligned piece of her universe had finally clicked into place. She lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, content to study him in the soft grey light. In sleep he looked younger, the stern lines of his face smoothed away, the judicial authority replaced by a startling vulnerability. His dark lashes rested against his sharp cheekbones, and his mouth, which she now knew could be so devastatingly skilled, was relaxed in a soft, peaceful line. This was Aiden. Not the judge, not the protector, but the man himself, unguarded and real. And he was, she admitted to herself with a jolt, devastatingly handsome. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were unfocused, and then they locked on her, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. It was the same smile she had seen at the chessboard, the genuine, unguarded smile that transformed him. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, thick with sleep. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her even closer, burying his face in her hair with a contented sigh. It was the gesture of a man who had woken up to a dream he never wanted to end. "Morning," she whispered back, her voice catching in her throat. The simple domesticity of the moment, the sheer, unadulterated intimacy of it, was more potent than all the passion of the night before. This was the aftermath, the quiet, sun-drenched, or in their case storm-drenched morning, where the consequences of their actions had to be faced. But looking into his warm, adoring eyes, she couldn't bring herself to feel anything but a deep, resonant joy. The forced proximity had become a willing, eager closeness. He propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze tracing the curve of her shoulder, the line of her throat. "No regrets?" he asked, his voice soft, the question a genuine inquiry, not an accusation. He was giving her an out, a chance to dismiss the night as a product of the storm, a temporary madness. It was a test, and she knew her answer was important. It would set the course for whatever came next, after the rain stopped and the real world came rushing back in. She met his gaze without hesitation, her heart full of a terrifying, exhilarating certainty. Not a single one. His answering smile was a revelation. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, the smile of a man who had laid his heart on the line and been met with acceptance. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss that was a world away from the desperate passion of the night before. It was a kiss of reassurance, of shared understanding, a seal on the unspoken pact they had made. There were no regrets. There was only this new, beautiful and terrifying reality they had created together. They spent the morning in bed, a tangled mess of limbs and silk sheets, talking. They talked with the feverish intensity of people who feel they are running out of time. The storm still raged outside, a constant reminder of their borrowed time, their stolen moments in this bubble of luxury and intimacy. He told her about the immense pressure of his job, the weight of the lives he held in his hands, the profound loneliness that came with the gavel and the robe. He spoke of a life spent in the service of an abstract concept, justice, and the personal toll it had taken. Ivy, in turn, told him of her own struggles, the fight to be taken seriously in a male-dominated field, the constant battle between artistic vision and commercial reality, the fear that she would compromise her integrity for success. She spoke of a past relationship that had ended badly, with a man who had seen her passion as a threat, who had tried to shrink her dreams to fit his own. In the safety of Aiden's arms, she shared the vulnerabilities she had long kept hidden, the secret fears that drove her relentless ambition. It was a morning of radical honesty, Dove stripping away the final vestiges of their public personas. He was not just the powerful judge. He was a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. She was not just the brilliant architect. She was a woman who was fighting to build her own space in the world. The slow burn had given way to a deep, soulful recognition. They were not so different after all. They were both builders in their own way, seeking to create order and meaning in a chaotic world. Later they showered together, a sensual dance of steam and water and slick skin. It was an act of profound domesticity that was somehow more intimate than anything that had come before. He washed her hair, his fingers gentle and sure in their movements, his touch a silent promise of care, of protection. It was the ultimate gesture from the protective hero, a quiet act of service that spoke volumes. In that small, steamy enclosure, with the world shut out, they were just a man and a woman in love. The realization hit Ivy with the force of a physical blow. Love. The word bloomed in her chest, warm and terrifying and undeniable. It was too soon, too fast, too impossible. It was a love born in a storm, in a gilded cage isolated from the harsh realities of their disparate lives. But it was real. She knew it with the same certainty that she knew the structural integrity of a well-designed building. It was a love that was both perfectly designed and utterly chaotically human. She looked at him through the steam, at the water running down the hard plains of his chest, and knew that she had completely and irrevocably lost her heart to the stranger in the luxury hotel. Dressed in another of his impossibly soft cashmere sweaters and a pair of trousers that were ridiculously long on her, Ivy felt a sense of belonging that was entirely at odds with her borrowed clothes. She padded into the main room, her bare feet silent on the plush rug. Aiden was on the phone, his back to her, and the change in his demeanor was instantaneous and jarring. The warm, attentive lover was gone, replaced by the formidable Judge Parker. His voice was crisp, authoritative, the cadence of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed. Unacceptable. The city's response has been sluggish at best. I want a full briefing on my desk the moment the roads are clear. No, I don't care about protocol. Make it happen. He listened for a moment, his jaw tight. I understand. Keep me informed. He ended the call and stood for a long moment staring out at the storm, his shoulders rigid with a familiar tension. The real world had just intruded on their sanctuary, a cold draft under the door, and it had brought with it the man he had to be outside of this room. He turned and saw her, and the transformation was immediate. The tension in his shoulders eased, the hard lines of his face softened, and the judge was replaced once more by Aiden. I'm sorry, he said, his voice laced with a frustration that wasn't directed at her. The world keeps trying to break in. He walked over to her, his long strides eating up the space between them, and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, as if she were an anchor in the turbulent sea of his life. It's okay, she whispered into his chest, her arms wrapping around his waist. But it wasn't okay. The phone call was a stark reminder of what she had allowed herself to forget. This was temporary. The storm would end. The roads would clear, and Judge Aiden Parker would have to return to his world, a world of briefings and protocols, a world where she, a humble architect, had no place. The beautiful blueprint they had drawn together was for a structure that could only exist in this one isolated location. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. Don't, he said softly, his eyes searching hers, seeing the doubt, the fear. Don't let them in, not yet. We still have today. It was a plea from a man who rarely pleaded for anything. He was asking her to stay in the moment, to hold on to the magic of their bubble for as long as they could. But the architect in her couldn't help but see the flaw in the design. A structure built without a foundation cannot stand. And their connection, as intense and real as it was, had no foundation in the real world. The rest of the day was tinged with a sweet, aching sadness. They tried to recapture the easy intimacy of the morning, but the knowledge of the outside world was a constant, unspoken presence. They played another game of chess, but their moves were distracted, their focus gone. They ate lunch in a near silence, the quiet no longer companionable, but filled with the things they weren't saying. The slow burn had reached its peak and was now threatening to burn out, consumed by the encroaching reality. This was the painful side of the luxury romance, the knowledge that the fairy tale had a final chapter. Later in the afternoon, as they stood by the window, they saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible break in the solid grey clouds, a sliver of watery pale blue. The storm was ending. Their time was running out. Ivy felt a pang of loss so sharp it was a physical pain. She had found something extraordinary in this gilded cage, a connection she had only dreamed of, and now the door was about to be opened. And she would have to walk out back into her own life, leaving the man she had fallen in love with behind. Aiden's hand found hers, his fingers lacing with hers, a desperate, possessive grip. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. His touch said it all. He was just as terrified of the end as she was. As dusk began to settle, painting the clearing sky in shades of soft pink and bruised purple, the power in the city fully returned. One by one, then in a flood, the lights of the buildings below flickered to life, a triumphant, glittering spectacle against the fading daylight. The city was waking up, stretching after its long, storm-induced slumber. The sight was beautiful, a testament to resilience, but to Ivy it felt like a death knell. Each new light was a nail in the coffin of the private world she and Aiden had shared. The hotel came alive with a new energy. The muffled silence was replaced by the distant hum of vacuum cleaners, the faint chime of elevators, the sounds of a world getting back to business. Aiden's phone began to buzz incessantly, the demands of his life clamoring for his attention. He ignored it for as long as he could, his focus entirely on Ivy, his expression a mixture of love and a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. The forced proximity was over, and the freedom felt more like a prison sentence. They stood on opposite sides of the room, the space between them now a vast, unbridgeable chasm. They were no longer just Ivy and Aiden. He was Judge Parker, a man of immense public importance, and she was Ivy Sanders, the architect who had stumbled into his life. The roles they had shared were now settling back onto their shoulders, heavy and ill-fitting. The slow burn had ended, leaving behind the ashes of a love story that had been written in a language that couldn't be translated into the real world. "My driver will be here in an hour," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. He was already rebuilding his walls brick by painful brick. It was a defense mechanism, a way to survive the impending separation. The protective hero was retreating, not to protect her, but to protect his own shattered heart. "He'll take you wherever you need to go. I've arranged for your purse and phone to be retrieved from the venue's security. They'll be waiting for you at your apartment." He had thought of everything, every practical detail, a desperate attempt to impose order on the beautiful chaos they had created. "Aiden, don't," she whispered, her voice breaking. She couldn't bear his retreat into cold, judicial efficiency. "Don't do this. Don't shut me out." She crossed the room, her steps echoing in the sudden silence. She came to a stop in front of him, close enough to see the anguish in his winter-blue eyes, the fierce battle he was waging with himself. She placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart, and could feel its frantic, unsteady rhythm. "This was real," she said, her voice gaining strength, conviction. "What happened here between us? It wasn't just the storm. You know it, and I know it. Don't let your world, your rules, your protocols tell you that it wasn't." She was fighting for them, for the fragile, beautiful structure they had built. She was an architect, and she would not let her greatest creation be demolished without a fight. The passion that he had admired in her speech was now directed entirely at him, a focused, powerful beam of love and defiance. He looked down at her, his composure finally cracking, the anguish in his eyes raw and exposed. "Ivy," he breathed, his voice ragged, "you don't understand what you're asking. My life, it will destroy something as beautiful and pure as you." "Let me be the one to decide that," Ivy insisted, her grip on his shirt tightening. "You rescued me, Aiden. You were the protective hero who brought me to this castle in the sky to keep me safe from the storm. But don't you see, the real storm isn't out there. It's in here," she tapped his chest gently. "It's the one you've been weathering all alone for years. You don't have to do that anymore." Her words were a direct hit, bypassing his logic and striking right at the heart of his loneliness. She had seen him, the real him, and she wasn't afraid. This was the climax, the emotional point of no return. The initial hook of the story, a woman waking up with a powerful stranger, was now being answered. He was no longer just the powerful judge. He was the man she loved. And she was no longer the disoriented victim. She was the woman who was choosing to fight for him. The luxury romance had transcended its opulent setting and become a raw, honest plea for a future that seemed impossible just a few hours ago. The forced proximity had ended, but it had forged a bond that refused to be broken by distance. Aiden looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a judge, Not a protector, but just a man terrified of losing the one thing that had made him feel truly alive. The carefully constructed walls of his composure crumbled into dust. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, bruising embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and his body shuddered with the force of a sob he refused to let escape. It was a moment of complete and utter surrender, the final unconditional capitulation of his heart. "I can't lose you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, the words muffled by her hair. "Ivy, I can't go back to the way it was before. Before you." It was the confession she had been waiting for, the unequivocal admission that what they had was real, essential, life-altering. He was choosing her. He was choosing them. He was choosing to face the complications, the scrutiny, the collision of their worlds, because the alternative, a life without her, was simply unbearable. He pulled back, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears she hadn't even realized she was crying. "There will be challenges," he said, his voice steady now, filled with a new, fierce resolve. "My life is not simple. People will talk. The press will be intrusive, but I will protect you. I will stand between you and all of it. Just tell me you're willing to try. Tell me you'll build this with me." He was asking for her help, her partnership. He was asking the architect to help him design a new life, a new future for both of them. Ivy looked up at the man she had woken up next to 2 days ago, a stranger who had become her entire world. She saw her future in his eyes, a future that would be complicated and challenging, but also filled with a love and a passion she had never imagined possible. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean, clear air of a new beginning. She had woken up in a luxury hotel, and in doing so she had found the one thing money could never buy, a home for her heart. She smiled through her tears, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered, "let's build it together. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Your support means everything. Hit the bell so you never miss the next luxury romance, and tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching tonight? I can't wait to know."